Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm recapping my experience attending Pasadena Comic Con. And as I've said, when I've talked about several fan conventions now at this point on this podcast, they're always such an absolute blast. And I've basically fallen into a rhythm now in terms of when I get there, I basically scope out the entire floor. I look through all the aisles, I see all the cool merchandise and things people are selling, and then I look to see where the guests are signing autographs and things like that. And then I kind of plan out, okay, well, I'll go meet that person first. It's based on if there's a lot of people around or not. Like if there's, not as many, then I'll go up to that person first. But for the most part, I just go with the flow. That's just kind of like when I initially get there, I take it all in. Then after that, I'm like, okay, let's just see where the day takes me. And at this convention in particular, I chatted with a lot of the artists, and a lot of them have written and drawn their own comic books, which I find so amazing. So I was looking through their artwork and I was saying, oh my goodness, you're so talented. This is so cool. And I asked a bunch of people if they'd be interested in being interviewed on my podcast. So I look forward to, in upcoming episodes, interviewing a lot of these really talented people, because I find it so inspiring that this is their passion project. They created, say, a comic book, and now they're out here selling it to people, and that's really wonderful. But a lot of them, pretty much all of them actually, they also have day jobs, myself included. Like this podcast, for example, is a passion project, because one person asked me, how long have you been doing the podcast? I said, since September 2018. And he was like, oh, wow, it's amazing. And so anyway, just hearing all of their premises of their stories and stuff. And I love hearing about their creative process. So I'm looking forward to getting to know these wonderful people better through interviewing them on this podcast. So stay tuned for that. So basically, I just get inspiration from people who work their day jobs, but then have their passion projects, their creativity that they hope to turn into, their main source of income, ideally. That's myself, too, as a writer, because I was chatting with a lot of people saying, oh, yeah, well, I'm in a writer's group and, I'm plugging away. My goal is to start getting meetings and to get repped. That's my goal, really. And same with, because I've got the TV writing, I've got also the picture book writing. So with that, hoping to, get an agent, to get published. But with everything, it takes a long, I've asked them too, oh, how long did this take you? And a lot of them saying, yeah, it took a long time, but well, look, you kept at it, and look, now you've got your wonderful book, and that's amazing. So I find that all really inspiring. So again, just the spontaneity of, and I don't plan it in the moment. I'm just I'm genuinely curious though. I genuinely want to hear about their work. And then I'm let me just ask them, would you want to be on my podcast? And everyone said yes that I asked. So again, I'm looking forward to chatting with them more in depth. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, so in terms of the autographs and everything of voice actors and stuff like that, a few people I knew specifically I wanted to meet. And the first person I went to go meet was Melanie Chartoff, aka the voice of Didi Pickles from Rugrats, the original Rugrats, I should specify. But so she wrote a wonderful book of essays called Odd Woman Out. And so I brought my copy for her to sign. And then she was like, oh, so have you read the book? I was like, yes, I have. And she's like, oh, and you still like me? And I was like, of course. It just was too funny. And I was telling her, I was like, your book is so well written, so much humor. And she has such candor in the stories she shares, getting into really intimate details about her life, in the past and her home life, and the highs and lows of her acting career and things of that nature. And then I was telling her too that I love the overall message of your book, that it's never too late, because she gets candid about her dating life, and then she ends up marrying, she got married later on in life. So I was like, that's, I find it all really inspiring. And she was like, thank you so much. And because she also played on Seinfeld, another iconic role that she's known for, despite Didi Pickles, of course. She played one of George's girlfriends, one of his girlfriends throughout the show on Seinfeld. And it's one of my favorite scenes in the entire show. I'm cracking up just thinking of it now. When George is he's at the kids' party and he's dating, I don't forget what her character's name in the episode, but it's the fire. And he's like, I smell some smoke back here. And he's like, fire, fire. The kids are screaming. He pushes them all out of the way. He knocks over her elderly mother. And then afterward, when he's like, I risked my life to make sure that exit was clear. And then she's like, but I saw you ran out in a mad panic. I saw you push everyone away. When you ran out, you left everyone behind. Seemingly. It's so stupid. It's so ridiculous. He's trying to dig himself out of the hole, knowing he can't, he's so so full of it. And then like even the fireman guy is like, how do you live with yourself? And George just says, it's not easy. It's so funny. So her character is so great in that episode, like just not standing for George's BS, not falling for it. And then she returns in the finale as well. And like, just recapping all of that. And because who also was there from Seinfeld was Larry Thomas, none other than the soup Nazi. No soup for you, Too funny, another iconic line from Seinfeld. So she just was wonderful to chat with. At first, like when I first met her, she's like, oh, I love your nails. I was like, oh, thank you. Actually, I gotta, gotta touch them up, get a new color soon, so it's too funny. Again, I highly recommend her book. It's fantastic. She had like her copies there to buy too, but I had my copy for her to sign. So she just is wonderful. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. So well written. It's excellent. So, can't recommend that enough. And then, like I said, I was like just chatting with a lot of artists. People, I just love the spark of creativity, and just like that like-minded thing of like you got your work ethic. Because I was chatting with one woman who did a comic book, and then she was saying her husband basically does like the business side of everything. I was like, oh, it's a great balance. Like you're able to focus more on your art, and then he does things like planning, like helping out with the website, and also like organize, like, even like packing the car with all of the stuff they're going to, like, for the booth itself at these conventions. I was like, that's really cool. I was chatting with another person who has had his comics published on with the New Yorker. I was like, that's incredible. So again, like I'm so inspired. I was chatting with this duo, these two friends who one of them was the writer and the other one's the artist of this comic book series they've done. They had another friend, they were saying that their friend wasn't there, but they had their own comic as well that they self-published and they wrote and drew it themselves. I was like, that's so amazing. I was like looking through it. I was like, my goodness, they're so talented. So again, I'm always so inspired by other people's work, and these people who do it themselves, like truly have the passion for it and like see it through. Because I was telling some of them, I was like, yeah, I wrote my own comic book. It was like during COVID, and then I commissioned an artist to get it made. And I was like, they were like, oh, that's so cool. Where can I find it? I appreciate when people take an interest, like, however brief, it's like, oh, so where can I find your podcast? But for the most part, people, like, I like hearing about them, though. I like hearing about I was like, oh, tell me about your work. Like, I find that all really interesting. So then I was like looking around, and then I saw like this really long line, and I was like, who is this line for? And they were like, oh, Tom Kenny. I was like, oh my gosh, no wonder. Because then like I saw after the fact, I see people like with SpongeBob Funko Pops. So Tom Kenny, unsurprisingly, had one of the consistently really super long lines to meet him and to get autographs and pictures. And he was one of the few people who I saw, he wasn't sitting, like he wasn't behind a table sitting. And I seem to recall, like in an interview, he said that he never sits when he records either. He always stands because he's very animated, and I guess he likes to express himself, of course. So that probably enhances the performance for him. So he was standing, and he had like a block on the table so that it could be like at level, so he didn't have to like crouch down to like sign things. But just overhearing like snippets of conversation, and I didn't go meet him because I have to like, pick and choose in terms of like, what am I going to spend money on? I can't like just like blow it all like at one, you know what I mean? Like, to be honest, I have to like tell myself, okay, well, like next time I could like plan for that at like the next one he'll be at that I can hopefully, in terms of like when it'll be another convention near me. So, I was like, okay, well, next time I'll love to meet Tom Kenny. But I was like, it's such a long line. And when there's long lines, that for whatever reason makes me feel more intimidated. That puts me more in like the mindset of like, oh, I'm a fan going to meet a fan of like, SpongeBob, for example. Like, Tom Kenny known for SpongeBob and millions of other characters, but that certainly is like one of his longest running characters, obviously. And it's crazy to think that the show is turning 25 this year, going to be celebrating its 25th anniversary. My, does time fly. That's wild. But because what I vastly prefer actually, is that when there aren't any lines, you can just like walk up and just like chat with them and say hello. Because again, like when there's a line, I've waited in lines here and there when I've had to, like when I'm pressed for time. Like I did that with Hell of a Boss, for example, when I went to Anime Pasadena. Like I waited in line to meet Brandon Rogers. But for the most part, and like I was chatting with other fans though with that too, so that was a little different. But these really amazing cosplayers. But for the most part, again, I purposely wait. Like I saw, for example, also Grey Delisle had a consistently really long line, and she was decked out as Azula, of course, Azula from Avatar: The Last Airbender. And she's so talented too. Obviously, she does hundreds and hundreds of so many iconic cartoon character voices, but also she does stand-up comedy. She has a music career, so she's so multi-talented as well. She just seems like such a warm, funny, kind, wonderful person. But so all that to say is I didn't meet Tom Kenny at this convention, but like I saw him, so I've seen him at other conventions too, like when he did a panel when I went to LA Comic Con my first year attending. So that's really cool. But so eventually I would have met him if it wasn't like such a really long line, to be honest. I was like, next time, honestly. My goodness. And like I'll save up to get like a print and a selfie for that. Anyway, so same with Greg Delisle. But so like even like Butch Hartman, for example, had like another really long line. I was like, I want to say hi to Butch again, but I'll wait. Because like there's kind of like lulls at certain points, because then people go to get lunch and they come back, and like they themselves obviously like they take a break, they go get lunch. So like at some points like they just aren't even at the table, and just like their helper or assistant person is at the table. And Butch in particular, he like his assistant people are like such a well-oiled machine. And what's so funny is that they remembered me. I was like, oh, they were like, a couple of them, they were like, I remember you. You were at another convention. I was like, yes, I was at Toon Con. They were like, okay, I do remember you. And I was like, yeah, now I'm rocking my Danny Phantom shirt. So literally the day before I went out and purchased a Danny Phantom shirt, specifically because I knew I wanted to go meet David Kaufman. And I didn't meet him last time at Toon Con because he was there. He was rocking the DP shirt. But so like, and I didn't meet him, and I could have. He was like right there. I was like, I don't have, I'm like running out of money here. Again, I have to be practical. I just do, because honestly, like after a few people, if you want to get like an autograph and a selfie combo, whatever, like it adds up after 4, 5, 6 people, honestly, you know what I mean? So I got to like be mindful of that. So I was happy I was able to meet David this time around. But so first though, so it's like, it was funny. I was chatting with Butch's like assistant people, and one of them, he was saying how like by like kind of a stroke of luck, because he had met Butch years ago, and then he had randomly ran into Butch again like a year or two ago, like at a Trader Joe's. He said like I was leaving and Butch was coming in, and then Butch was like, he remembered him, and then he's like, oh, if you're interested in working for me. I was like, oh, that's so amazing. And because he said like he's working on his own artwork, so like he had done one of Butch's classes, like because Butch has all these other business ventures, of course. And I was like, that's so cool. So you guys like were able to like reconnect, and then like look at you now, like that's so amazing. It's like you're learning from him and stuff. And he's like, I try to work these conventions when I can, but then Butch goes to like all these other conventions to other states, obviously too. I was like, oh yeah, of course. So I was looking through all of Butch's stuff, and again I was like, oh my god, this like it's so cool, like all these sketches and everything. But like, I'm like, I gotta save up for one. I was like, maybe next time anyway. But so because last time when I met Butch, I got a selfie with him anyway. But so when I went up to him and he was like, oh, I love your shirt. And then, because I had my Danny Phantom shirt, of course. I was like, oh, thank you. He's like, where'd you get it from? And then I was like blanking. I was like, oh my God, why can't I remember the name? I was like, oh, Hot Topic. He was like, oh, okay. And he's like, oh, it's a great shirt. I was like, oh, thank you. And then so I said to him, So first off, like on a side note, if you listen to my episode on Toon Con, which if you haven't, I recommend you listen to, like go back and listen to it. I know you're not going to pause this and go listen to it now, but like if you haven't, it's just a fun one because I recap meeting a bunch of people and like going to the panels and everything. But so at that one, I shared how I had to work up the nerve to ask Darren Norris and Susanne Blakeslee an intimate question about Cosmo and Wanda. And then I had said, in hindsight, I wished I had asked Butch, but like I lost my nerve. I didn't ask Butch. But what I said was, I'm sure Butch would just like answer without answering. So that's what I said then. So then at this convention, I'm happy to tell you, I worked up the nerve to ask him. So I told him I had to work up the nerve to ask Darren and Susanne. Now I want to ask you. And he's like, okay, what's the question? I said, okay, so it's a Cosmo and Wanda question. The question is, do you think Cosmo and Wanda incorporate magic into their lovemaking? And I pointed at Cosmo and Wanda because I'm just like, Cosmo and Wanda. Of course, he found a way not to answer it. And he said, well, you have to ask Cosmo. And I said, well, I did ask Cosmo. And what he said was, I think she does, he doesn't. And then like he laughed at that. He was like, as fairies or as fish? I was like, oh, there you go. I don't know, So too funny. Again, like that's too funny. Like how did I know he'd answer without answering? That's too funny. But definitively, I think, yes, they do, of course, because they're fairies and they use magic for everything, so why wouldn't they do that? And also Susanne, when I had asked her back with Toon Con, she said, I would think they would. I was like, I do too. I would think they would. I'm telling you, I mean, magic, role play, that makes things easier. Okay. Sorry for putting that mental image in your head, but so glad I worked up the nerve to ask Butch that question. Okay, so now all I have to do is just ask Tara Strong whenever I eventually meet her. I haven't seen her at any of these cons yet that I've been to, so we'll see. I'm sure she'll have a really long line too, because she has, again, like hundreds and hundreds of characters. But rest assured that I'm going to ask her that question. That's like, I gotta hear her response, okay? So, it's too funny. Carlos Rocky was there too, but I didn't, I met him last time when I went to Toon Con. And it's funny because last time I had my Rocco shirt and I got a signed print of Rocco doing the phone sex operator, that episode, like, oh baby, oh baby, oh baby. But he didn't have that print this time. I was like, oh, interesting. He had a bunch of like Crocker prints. Like, Crocker obviously is like one of his well-known characters, but also like he's done so many other things like Reno 911, and he did a play with Susanne, because then I went back up to Susanne. I was like, oh, hi, Susanne. So nice to see you again. She was like, oh, nice to see you too. And I don't know if she actually remembered me. It doesn't really matter. But I was like, oh, like I met you at Toon Con. I guess I could have said, well, I'm the one who asked you that. I'm like, no, I'm not going to keep like saying that damn question, but whatever. Now it's been 3. I got 3 of them that I've asked. So there you go. But anyway, what was nice was that I was just chatting with her more. Like we had like a kind of a more in-depth conversation. Like we were chatting about a whole bunch of different things. Like, because first what I said to her was like, oh, it's too bad there aren't any panels. And she said, yeah, I think they were supposed to. But then because like the other stuff going on, I was like, oh yeah, because like the card show. But then I was saying to her, well, Susanne, I don't know if you saw that, like, there's like the new Fairly Odd reboot that's going to be coming out, because like all this stuff was leaked with that. And she said, oh gosh, she said like, well, I can't like confirm or deny because I signed an NDA. I was like, no, I get it. But, we were talking a little bit about that, because I was saying to her that, well, actually, there's like a new SpongeBob SquarePants movie coming out on Netflix, and the entire thing was leaked. And she was like, oh my God, really? And I was like, yeah, like the like SpongeBob SquarePants Sandy Cheeks. It's like a CGI movie coming out on Netflix. And then I told her, like, so with the Fairly Odd Parents reboot, like I saw online, it's going to be called Fairly Odd Parents: A New Wish. They have the new godchild. And there was like even leaked some of the script, and she was like, really, a script? I was like, yeah. And she's like, well, I can tell you, I know for a fact Darren and I didn't leak it. And I was like, no, I'm sure. And she was saying, it must have been someone on the inside. Like she said, it must have been like a production person. I was like, oh, I mean, yeah, because who has access to the files? I just find that insane. I was saying, unless there was like some kind of data breach, I don't know. So that was kind of crazy. But she was saying, though, hypothetically with this, I was like, I get it, I understand. But she was saying like that they don't record in person now. It's all like through Zoom. Like she says, like I record in my home and Darren records in his home, because I think Darren doesn't live in LA anymore. I'm realizing I forgot about that. So I guess that's why, because he wasn't at this convention. If he was, I would love to have chatted with him again. But I just love Suzanne's like energy. She just is like so nice to chat with, again, like so warm and just like so like, just like having a conversation. Like, once you take like the fandom out of it and you're just like talking with them one-on-one as people, like, it's kind of, we can just like connect better in that sense, and just like talking about other things outside of like the stuff they're known for, like I said, like outside of like Fairly Odd Parents. But so she was saying like, actually I record in my closet. I was like, oh, that's funny. And she's like, yeah, because it blocks out the sound. Like I put up like a like a blanket or whatever, it's like, block out the sound and stuff. I was like, there you go, that's good, that's too funny. But she's saying because like back in the day we would all record in person, which was so much better because we could bounce off of each other, and like that gave more room to ad-lib. And then she was saying because like when we'd have to like say things at the same time, it was easier because since we're there in person, we could just like look at each other and say it at the same time. I was like, oh yeah, because like I said to her, I was like, yeah, because you and Darren, like your Cosmo and Wanda, your mom and dad, you guys like are like this. I like crossed my fingers, like you have that rapport. She's like, I know, we could like just like we're able to do that in person. But she said like unfortunately like with Zoom it's like not the same because there's a delay. I was like, oh, I'm sure. So it kind of makes things more complicated. But then like we were talking about other stuff. We were talking about like we got into the subject of COVID somehow, and she was saying, well, thankfully, knock on wood, I haven't had it. And I was like, me too, actually, like knock on wood. She's like, well, this isn't actually, because we like knocked on the table. She's like, well, this isn't actually wood. I was like, I had this. I was like, yeah, but the gesture is there, it's all good. But she was saying that she went and got her COVID shot at Dodger Stadium, and she said she hadn't been there before. So she said like it was all very organized, and actually it was through Sean Penn, because like he runs this Haiti foundation, so it was through all of those people running it. I was like, oh wow, interesting. And she was like, yeah. And she's saying she was saying that, like, I was so happy because, like, when they first, like, announced the vaccine, I was able to get it earlier because she's like, oh, finally, I'm old enough. So I was like, oh, that's too funny, because I was telling her, like, yeah, I went to go get it, like, at Javits Center. She's like, oh, really, Javits Center? I was like, yeah, like, in New York, because that's when I was living in New York. So I told her, like, yeah, I used to commute to the city in New York. So, you know, going into Manhattan every day. So I told her, like, yeah, I went there. And I told her, I was like, I hadn't actually been there for a convention, but I was like, it's a really nice place, though, Jack, because I know they have, like, New York Comic Con. And then we're talking about, she was saying, like, oh, yeah, I've done, like, plays there. And I said, like, oh, do you still do plays? And she said, like, I do them here and there. She said, I did one actually a couple of years ago with Carlos. I was like, oh, really? She was like, yeah, with Carlos Alazraqui. And then she was saying that it was interesting because with the play, people kept dropping out because, like, with her character, it's like this really manipulative, mean, cruel character. I was like, oh, interesting that people kept dropping out. And she said, like, I was surprised because I was able to memorize all of that dialogue in, like, a week. I was like, oh, there you go. Like, you know, I was like, that's amazing. And then I was chatting with her a little bit about my own stuff. I was like, yeah, well, I'm a writer and, like, I'm in a writer's group and that's why I've moved out here. I'm, like, working toward that career. And she said, well, what can help too is, like, even getting to know, like, assistants. I was like, oh, you're absolutely right, because they know people. And she said, like, sometimes, like, these agents or whoever it may be, like, they're so busy, they have, like, so many things to read. So, like, they're not going to necessarily even read your script. It may have to go through, like, a lower person before, like, it gets to, like, someone higher up. So she said, like, that could be, like, a way in. I was like, oh, that's a really good tip. That's good advice, because, like, you're absolutely right. They know people too. And then I was telling her, because I said, like, well, at another convention, which was LA Comic Con, actually, that, like, one of the panels I went to, what they were saying was, like, don't always just, like, look up in terms of look at the people who are higher up, but look around, look at the people who are, like, your peers. Like, anyone can be anyone. And she's like, that's so true. Like, you know, so just, like, some nice advice like that. I could have just, like, stood there and, like, just been, like, chatting with her, like, but we were chatting for a while, but, like, I could have just, like, you know, not to take up all of her time. But again, like, it helps that, like, it was not as busy, thankfully. So we were just able to, like, really chat and connect. And she said, well, best of luck to you. She's like, I'm putting that out there. Like, great things are going to happen for you. I was like, oh, thank you so much. Like, I need that. And then I told her, like, wouldn't it be amazing if, like, a year from now I, like, see you again at a convention? I'm like, oh, Susanne, like, I'm working on this show now. She's like, yes, like, let's put that out there. I was like, yes, definitely. So I don't know. She just was wonderful. At one point too, I was like, I pointed to her because, like, they all have, like, banners and, like, pictures of their characters on them. And I pointed to it. I was like, oh, wait, you were the voice of that Ghost and Danny Phantom. And I distinctly remember the episode. It's the second episode of the show. I think it's called Parental Bonding. I loved it as a 13-year-old so much. That's, like, one of my favorites as a 13-year-old, the part when it's the episode, like, with that amulet and the ghost is like, I want to go to the ball or what. I don't even remember the ghost's name, but then that amulet ends up, like, you know, he takes the amulet and he gives it to Paulina, and then Paulina, like, gets to take your crummy amulet. She gives it, like, puts it on Sam, and then Sam turns into that dragon, shallow little witch, which my cousin and I would always quote and say that it was an inside joke, even though it's not an inside joke. It just was us quoting the show. I talked about that when if you listen to my episode talking about Danny Phantom, my favorite episode, Fanning the Flames, I talk about all that. So you can go listen to that if you're interested. But so I point to that character and she's like, you know, it was so long ago, I don't even remember. I was like, I don't blame you. I was like, I know I was like, it's going to be 20 years of Danny Phantom even. It's, like, crazy. So I don't know, like, she just is, I liked hearing a little bit about, like, her work ethic and, like, working on the show and, like, you know, a little bit of that, but also, like, stuff outside of that too. I don't know, I could have talked to her for a long time. She just was wonderful. So I look forward to talking. I just liked, you know, talking to her. She just is so funny. I already had a print, so I already had a print and a selfie, so it just was, you know, getting to chat with her more, which was nice. But then, maybe it was before that, actually, but, like, at one point then I, of course, went up to David Kaufman, because I knew I wanted to meet him. So at first he was like, he was so sweet, too. He's like, oh, I love your shirt, because I was rocking my Danny Phantom shirt. And so, because again, I knew I was going to meet him. I was like, yeah, I just bought this shirt because, like, I knew I wanted to meet you and get a picture and everything. He's like, oh, it's so cool. I love this shirt. I love the design. I was like, yeah, I know, right? It's, like, really, it's a cute shirt. I like it a lot. So I was chatting with him for a while too, because again, thankfully, when there wasn't, like, you know, a line or anything, I didn't have to feel rushed, and, like, it was nice. But not that they would rush you anyway, though. I could tell, like, they just are, like, happy to chat with fans and everything, which is, like, really sweet. Because, like, same with Tom Kenny, he had a really long line, but I guess, like, I could see he was, like, giving people, like, you know, like, really like listening and like chatting and like, he's just such a jubilant, wonderful, like his energy is contagious too. But so anyway, David, he just was so sweet. So I got a print that I'm staring at right now. He wrote, "To Allie, a super fan, I'm going ghost." And he drew a little ghost. It's so cute. Oh my goodness. But so I'm telling you, 13-year-old me's head would have exploded. I got to meet David Kaufman, Danny Phantom himself. But so first I was asking him kind of like a standard question, but I couldn't help myself. I was like, "David, I'm sure you always like get asked this question, but I'm just curious, like, do you have a favorite episode?" And he said, "Yeah, I like my brother's keeper episodes." He's like, "I like that like family bond with him and Jazz." I was like, "Oh yeah, I like that too." He's like, "I like that like sentiment, that like more emotional thing." And he said, "I also like the Frightmare Before Christmas episode." I was like, "Oh yeah, and Will Arnett." I realized that after the fact that Will Arnett voiced the villain in that. He's like, "Yeah, that's right." And it was all the rhyming. And then he said, "I also was a fan of the like dark Danny episode." I was like, "Oh right." Like I told him too. I was like, "It's been a minute since I've seen the show too." But I was saying, "Oh yeah, like the dark and light Danny." That's like when he's like Dan Phantom, and it's like this whole thing. It's like an hour-long special. This whole timeline of like if he goes bad. It's really interesting, that episode. I was like, "Oh, me too. I like that one too." And I said, "Well, an episode I always loved is like my favorite episode as a kid, like growing up, was always the Ember episode." He's like, "Oh yeah, Ember. People love Ember. That character like took on a life of its own." I was like, "I know, that's Tara Strong, of course." And I said, like, "I know that character's even in like the Nickelodeon like fighting game, like the Brawl, like All-Star Brawl game." And he's like, "Oh yeah, that's right." And then I was saying to him, because I said like, "Well, so I love the Ember episode, and I love also the finale. I thought was great." I said like, also I like, it's funny because like as a kid, like I loved so much. I still do. I'm a sucker for it. But I said like I loved Danny and Sam. I loved that they got together. And he's like, "I know, that's sweet." And then I said though, but I said to him, "But in hindsight, I realized that it's so much more interesting story-wise, the whole thing between Danny and Valerie." And he's like, "Yes, I agree." And then I was like, "Yeah, because it's interesting because she like develops feelings for Danny Fenton, but then she is fighting Danny Phantom, like she's ghost hunting Danny Phantom." I was like, "That's a much more interesting story arc, and like how he's developing feelings for her." But so that's funny. But so then he brought up with Ember, he was saying, "Yeah, actually my sister sent me something about like this person who apparently was like using, like had taken inspiration from Ember, but like in a bad way." And I was like, "Oh really?" That's like unexpected hearing that, because like for the most part, obviously this show, like it's a positive influence. It's so huge. And I was saying to him, "I know everyone would like love to see this show rebooted." And he was like, "I know." And then I was saying to him, "I don't know if you've heard, like over the years, there's always been rumors of like, and like most recently again, there's like rumors of a live action Danny Phantom movie." And he's like, "I have heard of that." And then I said, "Well, they did like a live action Kim Possible movie." And he's like, "Oh, did they?" I was like, "Yeah, a few years ago." And like, it didn't really do that well as far as I know. I don't think, 'cause it's like kind of just went away. But I was saying like, I'm surprised that show has been rebooted too, because that show was really popular, Kim Possible. And it was on around the same time as Danny Phantom. And I didn't have Disney Channel growing up, but I think I definitely would have loved that show like as a tween, because it's like similar things. It's like she's a superhero, and then there's like the whole will they won't they with her best friend Ron Stoppable, and then they eventually do end up together. And then there's like action, and then there's the comical villain. So it's a lot of similar themes in that show. So I was like, yeah, it's all really cool. But, Danny Phantom, like, it's still like so beloved. So he just was really sweet. It was really nice chatting with him. And then he actually took a picture with his phone, because he loved my shirt. He's like, "Oh, I'll get a picture too, and I'll post it on Instagram." I was like, "Oh, sure, why not? That's amazing." So like, also I asked him, "What's like the most requested line?" I was like, "I'm sure it's Going Ghost." He said, "Yeah." And also that line where he says like, "You're one mixed up Fruit Loop." And I was like, "Oh, right. That was like to Vlad." And he was like, "Yeah, that was to Vlad." I was like, "Oh, that's right." That's too funny. My gosh. But he just was so sweet. I don't know. It just was such a pleasure chatting with him. And then I also said to him, "Oh, do you keep in touch with Ricky, like the actor who voiced Tucker?" He said, "Not really. Like, I last saw him a few years ago." And then he said, like, "It's hard." I was like, "Oh yeah, I understand." And then I said to him, "Well, honestly, like if you, Gray, and Ricky did some kind of like quick video as like Danny, Sam, and Tucker, the internet would go crazy for that. Like that would definitely go viral." He's like, "I know, like you're right." And so like, because I said like, "Oh, the show's turning 20 this year." And he's like, "Oh, was it that this year?" I was like, "Yeah, because 2004. And he's like, "Oh, that's right, April 3rd, 2004. I was like, "Yep, that's exactly right. That's when it premiered." So that's too funny. So it just was like lovely chatting with him. And I appreciate that. Like he just, was like sharing all that stuff with me about the show, because I know like he's done other stuff too, but that's like, one of his biggest roles he's known for is Danny Phantom. So it just was such a pleasure chatting with him. So like, and again, fulfilling my 13-year-old self's love, like absolute love of Danny Phantom. So my like fangirling over that. So that's too funny. But so again, like it just is so much fun at these conventions, seeing all these wonderful people. I also at one point went up to this actor, Jeremy Miller, who was on the show Growing Pains. But what I found interesting was that he voiced Linus. So I was like, oh, wow, you voiced Linus? I was like, which specials? And then he said, well, so I voiced Linus in this Snoopy musical. I was like, oh, I hadn't heard of that. He's like, yeah, it was an hour-long special. They had people like train us and everything. And he said this was like around the same time as Growing Pains when he was voicing Linus. So he said like during the week he would do Growing Pains, and then like on the weekends he'd be recording for Peanuts. I was like, oh, it's amazing. And then I asked him like, so did you ever get to meet Charles Schultz? And I know Charles Schultz actually used to go by Sparky. And he said, well, actually I didn't get to meet him because the special, like the animated stuff, was more so run by Lee Mendelson and Bill Melendez. Like that was more like there, and like he would have like some say in it, but for the most part he was focused on the comics. I was like, oh, okay, of course. 'Cause he said like I was always a fan of Peanuts, and then to get to voice Linus was like a dream come true. I'm like, oh, it's amazing to get to be part of like a small part of that legacy of Peanuts. But so he also voiced him, he said, in the New Year's special. I was like, okay, was that 80s? Like, yeah, that was 80s. I was like, okay, I do remember that one. And then he also said in another one, it was like this, I don't even know what I forget now what it's called, like God Bless America or something, like basically a patriotic one, maybe a 4th of July special. I was like, oh, interesting, I gotta look into that. The Snoopy musical sounded interesting to me, because like there's been so many specials. So I don't know, it just was so much fun chatting with him. And then he said like, yeah, that was basically from 8 to 11 and a half, because around that age, like 11 and a half, that's when my voice started to change. And then they said they got to move on. I was like, oh, of course, because that's like maintaining the authenticity of the young, like, children's voices. So, but I was like, oh, such a pleasure, chatting with him. So I was like, oh, it's interesting hearing all that. Because again, like just like a small part of this legacy of these iconic characters. So it's so amazing. So again, I had so much fun meeting so many wonderful, talented people. Get to have such, just meeting so many of these wonderful folks, chatting with them. It's an absolute blast. It's such a joy, so exciting, such a blast. Just truly, again, like so much admiration and love and joy for all of these wonderful, talented folks. And again, can't wait to go to my next one. And with that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. Be sure to check out storytellingsaga.com. And as always, feel free to send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by emailing me at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Until next time, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.